In the high desert of New Mexico, the silence is a physical thing. It has weight. It presses in on you from the vast cerulean sky and rises from the sun-baked earth. For 5 years since my husband Richard's heart had abruptly, silently stopped beating in the night, I had learned to wear that silence like a shroud. At 63, I believed my life had been baked dry by the relentless Taos sun, leaving nothing but a cracked riverbed where passion and even simple joy used to flow. My world had shrunk to the thick, cool walls of my adobe home and the small, defiant courtyard garden I coaxed from the unforgiving soil. I was wrong. The day my life began again, the sun was a merciless white disk in the sky. The air was thin and smelled of dust and the faint, spicy perfume of sagebrush. I was on my knees, a wide-brimmed straw hat shielding my face, my hands caked in the reddish-brown clay soil as I tried to fortify the base of a struggling cholla cactus. My knuckles, etched with the fine, silvery lines of age, ached with a familiar throb. Richard had been the architect of this home, his hands shaping the very walls that now seemed to hold only echoes of his laughter. I was so lost in the rhythmic work, in the quiet conversation I was having with his ghost, that I didn't hear the footsteps on the gravel path behind me. "You have to be careful with those. They'll fight you back." The voice was low and melodic, a stark contrast to the sharp silence. I startled, my heart giving a painful lurch. I turned, shielding my eyes against the glare, and saw a silhouette standing at the edge of the courtyard. As my eyes adjusted, the silhouette resolved into a young man. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sun-weathered skin and easy posture that spoke of a life lived outdoors. He couldn't have been much older than 30. His hair was a dark, unruly mop, and his eyes, when he stepped closer into the shade of the portico, were the color of dark honey, warm and startlingly direct. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," he said, a slow, gentle smile forming on his lips. "I saw you from the road. I was just admiring the house. My name's Julian." "Annalise," I managed, my voice raspy from disuse. I felt a sudden, absurd wave of self-consciousness. My face was surely flushed and streaked with dirt, my old linen shirt stained with sweat. I pushed myself to my feet, brushing the clinging dust from my knees. "Not many people just wander by up here." "I'm not just wandering," he explained, his gaze sweeping over the house with a genuine, almost professional appreciation. "I'm a potter. I live down the valley. I've always been drawn to this place. The lines are perfect. It looks like it grew right out of the earth." "My husband built it," I said, the words catching in my throat. "He was a stonemason. He had a feel for the land." Julian nodded slowly, his honey-colored eyes holding mine. It wasn't a look of pity, the one I'd grown so accustomed to from neighbors and old friends. It was a look of understanding, of shared reverence. "I can see that," he said softly. "You can feel the hands that built it. It has a soul." No one had spoken of my house, of Richard's legacy, in that way for years. The observation was so astute, so deeply felt, that it disarmed me completely. We stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the faint, dry rustle of the wind through the chamisa bushes. He gestured with his chin toward the cholla. "I could help you with that if you like. My grandfather taught me how to mix adobe mud that will hold through the monsoon season." I should have said no. I should have thanked him and retreated back into the cool, safe solitude of my home. But I was tired of being safe. And I was intrigued by this young man who spoke of houses having souls. So I nodded. He spent the next hour with me in the courtyard. He showed me how to mix the soil with water and straw to the perfect consistency, his long, graceful fingers moving with a practiced ease. He worked quietly, with a focused, meditative energy that I found deeply calming. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us was different from the one I lived with. It wasn't an empty, echoing void. It was a shared space, full and peaceful. As he pressed the last of the wet adobe mud around the base of the cactus, his hand accidentally brushed against mine. It was a fleeting, innocent touch, but a jolt of warmth, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. It was a sensation so foreign, so long forgotten, that I drew in a sharp breath. I looked up, and his eyes were on me, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. I swallowed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Yes." "Fine, just the heat." He nodded, but I knew he didn't believe me. He saw more than I wanted him to see. He stood and wiped his muddy hands on his worn jeans. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the distant Sangre de Cristo mountains in hues of fiery orange and deep violet. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "But I have some desert marigold seeds, if you'd like them. They're resilient. They know how to bloom in the toughest conditions." He looked at me then, a direct, meaningful gaze that seemed to pierce right through the protective layers I had built around my heart. "I could bring them by sometime." "I'd like that," I heard myself say, the words feeling like they belonged to another woman, a younger, braver version of myself. "I'd like that very much." He gave me one last, lingering look before turning and walking away, his tall frame silhouetted against the spectacular bleeding sunset. I remained in the courtyard long after he was gone, my hand still tingling where he had touched it, staring at the mountains as they dissolved into purple shadows. The silence returned, but it had changed. A tiny, hopeful note now hummed within it. The week that followed was an exercise in managed expectations. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment of connection, a kind gesture from a stranger. A young man like that, full of life and talent, wouldn't give a second thought to a 63-year-old widow living alone on a dusty mesa. And yet, I found myself tidying the house with more care than usual. I spent an afternoon weeding the courtyard with a renewed vigor, and on Thursday I even put on a pair of silver earrings Richard had given me, their cool weight against my skin a strange and unfamiliar comfort. It was late Friday afternoon when I heard the sound of an old truck rattling up my long driveway. My heart leaped into my throat. I smoothed my dress with trembling hands and stepped out onto the portico, just as Julian climbed out of a dusty blue pickup. He was holding a small, unglazed terracotta pot. "I brought the seeds," he announced, his smile as warm as the afternoon sun. "And a proper home for them." He looked different today, less like a laborer and more like the artist he was. He wore a simple white linen shirt, and his dark hair was tied back at the nape of his neck. He walked toward me with that same unhurried grace, and my carefully constructed composure began to crumble. "You came back," I said, the words breathy with a relief I hadn't known I was feeling. "I said I would," he replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We spent the afternoon planting the marigolds in the pot, our hands moving close together in the rich, dark soil. The conversation flowed more easily this time. It started with gardening, with the stubborn resilience of desert plants, but soon drifted into deeper waters. He told me about his work, about the way the clay felt in his hands, how he tried to imbue each piece with a sense of place, a piece of the desert's spirit. I found myself telling him about Richard, not just about his death, but about his life, about the way he would read poetry to me on the porch during thunderstorms, his voice a low rumble against the crash of the heavens. I hadn't spoken of these things with anyone. My sons, loving as they were, always grew quiet and uncomfortable when I mentioned their father. They wanted me to move on, to be happy, not realizing that he was a part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being. But Julian listened. He didn't offer platitudes or try to change the subject. He just listened, his honey-colored eyes full of a profound, empathetic intelligence. We sat on the bench under the shade of the portico, sipping cool water from glasses beaded with condensation. The sun beat down, and the air shimmered with heat. "When I was a boy," he said, after a long, comfortable silence, "my grandfather told me that the most beautiful things are the ones that have lived a life, the ones with cracks and scars. He was talking about pottery, but I think he meant people too." He turned to me then, his gaze so intense it was almost unnerving. "You have a beautiful soul, Annalise. It shines out of you." Tears pricked my eyes. It was such a strange and lovely thing to say. At my age, you become accustomed to being overlooked, to becoming part of the scenery, to be seen, truly seen, with such clarity and appreciation, felt like a miracle. "The cracks are all I see most days," I whispered, looking down at my own wrinkled hands. "Then you're not looking closely enough," he said softly. His words hung in the still, hot air between us, intimate and true. He reached out, not for my hand, but to gently brush a stray wisp of gray hair from my cheek. His fingers were warm and calloused, and the brief touch sent a cascade of warmth through my entire body. He stood to leave as the shadows began to lengthen, promising to return the following week. After he left, I wandered through the quiet rooms of my house, touching the familiar objects Richard and I had collected over a lifetime. But for the first time in 5 years, they didn't feel like relics of a dead past. They felt like parts of a continuing story. Julian hadn't just brought seeds for my garden. He had planted something in me, something I thought had long since withered and died. Hope. The following week, the monsoons arrived. The sky, which had been a relentless, cloudless blue, turned a dramatic, bruised purple. The wind picked up, howling down from the mountains, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. I had always loved the storms, but since Richard's death, they had only amplified my loneliness. On Wednesday, in the midst of a particularly violent downpour, Julian's truck appeared at the end of my driveway like an apparition. He ran to the porch, laughing, his hair and shirt soaked through. I ushered him inside, my heart doing a frantic, joyful dance. The power had flickered and died, so I lit a few candles, their soft, dancing flames casting flickering shadows on the adobe walls. "I was worried about you up here alone," he said, shaking the rain from his hair. "These storms can be wild." "I'm used to them," I said, handing him a towel. "But I admit they're better with company." We sat at the old wooden kitchen table, the storm raging outside, creating a cocoon of intimacy around us. It was in the flickering candlelight that he finally told me about himself. He spoke of a life in a busy city, of a promising career in finance that had left him feeling hollow and lost. He spoke of a great love, a woman who had been killed in a senseless accident, a tragedy that had shattered his world and sent him fleeing to the desert in search of a quiet place to heal. As he spoke, I saw the source of his old soul wisdom, the deep well of pain that fed his empathy. He was not a boy, but a man who had known profound loss, just as I had. Our griefs were different, born of different circumstances, but they spoke the same language. In that moment, the 30-year gap between our ages evaporated, leaving only two human beings who recognized the landscape of each other's sorrow. Impulsively, I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with mine, his grip firm and reassuring. The thunder rolled in the distance, and the candlelight danced across his face, illuminating the silent tears tracing paths down his cheeks. "You're the first person I've told that to," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed emotion. Sometimes," I said softly, "it's easier to talk to a stranger." "You're not a stranger, Annalise," he said, his gaze meeting mine across the table. "I feel like I've known you my whole life." The storm subsided as evening fell, leaving the air washed clean and the desert smelling of rain and creosote. The power was still out. He stood, and without a word, came around the table and gently pulled me to my feet. We stood in the near darkness of the kitchen, So close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. He smelled of rain and damp earth. He lifted his hand and cupped my cheek, his thumb gently stroking my skin. His touch was reverent, almost hesitant. He wasn't a young man taking what he wanted. He was a man asking a question. I gave him my answer by leaning into his touch, by closing my eyes. When his lips met mine, it was nothing like the fumbling kisses of my youth or the comfortable, familiar pecks of my long marriage. It was a discovery. It was slow and deep and searching, a silent conversation in which we poured out all the loneliness and longing that words could never express. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and rain and second chances. When we pulled apart, we simply held each other for a long time, my head resting against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around me. Nothing else happened that night. Nothing else needed to. When the storm had passed completely, he kissed my forehead and left, leaving me in a house that no longer felt empty, but full of a quiet, trembling electricity. Our relationship unfolded slowly in the weeks that followed, as naturally and as surely as a desert flower turning its face to the sun. He came to my home not just as a visitor, but as a partner. We cooked meals together, our bodies moving around each other in the kitchen with an easy, practiced grace. We took long walks in the evenings, watching the sky put on its nightly spectacular show. He brought his potter's wheel to my studio, the one that had sat dormant since Richard's death, and we spent hours with our hands in the clay, creating new things together. He never made me feel old. He made me feel timeless. He loved the stories etched on my face, the silver in my hair, the wisdom in my heart. With him, I was not a relic of a bygone era, but a woman in full bloom. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to pepper the vast, inky canvas of the sky, he took my hand. "I know what this must look like to other people," he said quietly, his voice serious. "And I don't care, but I need to know that you are okay with it, with us." I looked at him, at this beautiful, gentle man who had wandered into my barren life and made it fertile again. I thought of the years of silence, of the belief that my life was over. I thought of the joy, the laughter, the profound connection he had brought back into my world. "Julian," I said, my voice clear and steady, "for the first time in 5 years, I feel more than just okay. With you, I feel alive. I spent decades of my life doing what was expected, raising my sons, being a good wife, a respectable member of the community. I thought that was the whole story. I never expected a final chapter." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "This isn't the final chapter, Annalise," he murmured against my skin. "This is a whole new book." And he was right. It wasn't a storybook romance. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more real. It was the story of two lonely souls who found each other in the vast, silent expanse of the desert. It was proof that in the driest, most desolate of places, the most extraordinary and unexpected life can take root. And as we sat together in the starlight, holding hands, the silence was no longer a shroud of grief, but a sacred space filled with the promise of all the sunrises we had yet to share.